You may see her wandering the town, though she won't see you, for she's lost in her own chaotic musings. I think that's what really drives you crazy. Even when you had her, you never really had her. Her mind was elsewhere, somewhere you never understood. So nothing was really different now. Her eyes passing over you like she never knew you either. She keeps going, her movements dizzying, though each step is most intentional, methodical. What is she thinking? Where is she going? You watch her turn the corner, and then she's truly gone. The woman, the enigma, the most curious mystery of them all. This is Mirrors, a collection of horrors, history, and hauntings. My name is Gabby, and I'm a writer who is obsessed with all things paranormal. On this podcast, I go to haunted places, delving into their stories and the history behind them. Back in November, I embarked on a road trip to the most haunted locations in New England. Starting off at the Union Cemetery, known to be haunted by a woman in a white gown, once investigated by the world-famous Ed and Lorraine Warren. Next up was Seaside Sanatorium, where I stood along the coast, looking up to the abandoned buildings where children with tuberculosis were once treated. In Rhode Island, I walked the rows of graves at the Chestnut Hill Cemetery, searching for the final resting place of Mercy Brown, known as the last vampire of New England. I drove through Massachusetts, passing through the shadowy, mysterious Freetown Fall River State Forest, home to tales of UFOs, Bigfoot, Puckwudgies, and all too real murders and crimes. Finally, I ended up in Salem to revisit the location of my strangest, yet coolest, paranormal experience. Then I and any ghosts I collected along the way headed back to my ghost neighbors here in Gettysburg. Oh wait, I forgot something. I spent the night at one of the most famous haunted houses in the world, the Lizzie Borden House, where Lizzie Borden killed her father and stepmother back in 1892. Or did she? That's the thing. These murders remain unsolved, leaving this home humming with residual energy. So here we are, the moment you've all been waiting for. To wrap up season 2, I am bringing you along with me to the Lizzie Borden House. For the next 3 weeks, we'll be delving into the history and hauntings. And today we're starting all the way back at the beginning, on July 19th, 1860, when Lizzie Andrew Borden was born in Fall River, Massachusetts. Her parents, Sarah and Andrew, had 2 other children, Emma, who was 9 years older than Lizzie, and Alice Borden, who died in infancy just 2 years before Lizzie was born. Sarah Borden died when Lizzie was just 3, and Andrew remarried a woman named Abby Durfee Gray in 1865. Lizzie and Emma never really had a good relationship with Abby, addressing her as Mrs. Borden. Since Emma was 9 years older than Lizzie, she took a protective, maternal role in her life. They both also worried that Abby was taking advantage of their family's finances, as their father was a well-known businessman in Fall River. Andrew was self-made, involved in a variety of successful ventures. He had his hand in the furniture and casket industries, owned real estate and textile mills, was the president of the Union Savings Bank, and a director of the Durfee Safe Deposit and Trust Company. Just a note, Abby Durfee Gray wasn't associated with this company despite having the same name. Prior to the murders, Andrew had an estimated net worth of $300,000, which would be about $10 million today. So he had quite the financial portfolio, able to fulfill his daughter's every desire. For Lizzie and Emma craved a life of luxury. However, this wasn't necessarily the case. Andrew, despite his riches, was known to be quite frugal. The Bordens lived on 2nd Street, which was fairly modest considering their wealth. Lizzie and Emma were obsessed with the idea of living in the affluent Hill neighborhood with the high-class families of Fall River. Andrew also refused to update their home with modern luxuries, like indoor plumbing and electricity, leaving the family instead to use chamber pots and kerosene lamps. The Bordens lived more like a middle-class family, which Emma and Lizzie absolutely despised. This was definitely a point of contention in the family, which was heightened when Andrew transferred ownership of a house on 4th Street to Abby. Lizzie and Emma already suspected Abby of using their family for money, so this was the last straw. In an attempt to alleviate this tension, Andrew sold one of his rental properties to Lizzie and Emma for $1, which they then sold back to him for $5,000, coming out to about $180,000 today. So, still a generous sum of money, but not enough to appease the Borden daughters, who still felt their father strongly favored Abby. Lizzie attended public school in Fall River, but she didn't pursue higher education, nor was she known to have any specific career ambitions. Her family were members of the Central Congregational Church throughout her childhood, and she remained involved in church activities and local charities. She taught immigrant children at Sunday school and was part of the Women's Christian Temperance Union. In 1889, the family hired an Irish immigrant named Bridget Sullivan. She was a key figure in the family, eventually being a main reference point in conversations about the murders. But she was overworked and underappreciated by the Borden family. Abby was allegedly quite demanding of Bridget, while Andrew was dismissive of her. Bridget lived on the 3rd floor and was treated as an outsider. Lizzie and Emma even called her Maggie. I'm not entirely sure why, but it's telling that they couldn't even bother to call her by her real name. Her treatment was indicative of the class divide. Maggie could have even been a derogatory name, reflecting a prejudice against Bridget's Irish roots. In 1890, Lizzie had the rare opportunity to travel to Europe, spending 19 weeks experiencing the art, culture, and history of cities across Europe. She was a part of a travel group with other women, as it was uncommon for women to travel abroad alone at the time. There's not a whole lot documented about her trip, but it's entirely plausible that she could have returned to Fall River even more dissatisfied with her life in Massachusetts. Her appetite for luxury was finally fed, although it only left her hungrier. And this was just 2 years before the murders. Just saying. Lizzie was involved, well-known, and even quite respected in Fall River. She was described as quiet and reserved, while also being moody and having quite the temper. She also had quite the reputation of shoplifting, despite the fact that she could probably afford just about anything at the stores in Fall River. So while people knew of Lizzie, they didn't really know her. She had this air of mystery around her, which was further fueled by the fact that in her early 30s, she was still unmarried. Obviously not the norm at the time. And her family was about to be at the center of one of the most infamous murder cases, with Lizzie being the main suspect. I think a common misconception about Lizzie is her age. She was actually 32 at the time of the murders, and maybe it's just me, but I thought she was younger. About a year before the murders, there was a burglary at the Borden house, with Andrew's desk having been ransacked. Cash was stolen from him, as well as horse car tickets. Jewelry and other valuables were stolen from Abby, but Emma and Lizzie's belongings were seemingly untouched. What was strange about this was that there was no sign of forced entry into the home, and this happened in the middle of the day, leading people to suspect that the thief was already in the house. And with her history as a shoplifter, most fingers immediately pointed to Lizzie Borden. Was it her? We'll never really know. But again, her and Emma's things were left untouched. And some reports say Lizzie was caught trying to sell those same car tickets supposedly stolen from her father. It's possible that stories like these were fabricated after the murders to lean into the case against Lizzie, but who knows? Lizzie definitely seemed to have a quite rebellious side, and this incident inspired Mr. Borden to drop some serious cash and get locks installed around the house. 2 days before the murders, the Borden family, as well as Bridget Sullivan, fell ill, complaining of a debilitating stomachache. Abby went to a local doctor, fully convinced she'd been poisoned. But Dr. Bowen didn't really believe her. The illness obviously could have been due to food poisoning, considering the lack of proper refrigeration and food storage in the house, and the fact that they were eating days-old leftovers that had been set out in the oppressive heat. However, it is quite strange considering a local pharmacist would later come forward, sharing that Lizzie was in his shop before the murders. She had tried to buy prussic acid, one of the deadliest poisons, which she claimed she needed to clean a sealskin cape. The sale was refused, though, given the fact that acid is highly toxic, obviously, and required a prescription. With this testimony, many have suspected that Lizzie intended to poison her family, but had to resort to other methods. Which takes me to the fateful day of August 4th, 1892. As the sun rose, it was proving to be an unnaturally hot day in Fall River. Around 6 a.m., Bridget woke up to get started on her work for the day, still not feeling well. Andrew Borden had a pretty stringent routine, so he got up early to get started with his day as well. Emma was out of town visiting friends, and Lizzie was still in her room. Abby was in the kitchen helping Bridget prepare breakfast. They also had another guest, John Morse, Emma and Lizzie's uncle from their mother's side. He had showed up to the house unexpectedly the night before, saying he wanted to discuss business with Andrew. He too was interested in Andrew's rental properties. John joined Andrew and Abby in the dining room for breakfast, while Lizzie was noticeably absent, seemingly trying to avoid Abby. Around 8:30, John left to visit relatives in another part of town. Shortly after, Andrew left to run errands out in Fall River, making stops at a few banks around town. He would be out until about 10:45. Unbeknownst to him, his wife was dead upstairs when he returned home. At the house, Andrew had trouble unlocking the door, so he had to knock until Bridget let him in. He took off his boots and decided to rest on the sofa in the living room. Lizzie came into the room and told her father that Abby had left to go visit a sick friend. At this point, Bridget had gone to her room upstairs, needing rest as well, considering she'd been working all morning on top of not feeling well. Around 11:10 a.m., Lizzie called to Bridget, exclaiming that her father had been killed. Bridget ran downstairs, stumbling upon the mutilated body of Andrew Borden. Lizzie sent Bridget to get Dr. Bowen, who Abby had seen just the day before about her mysterious illness. I don't really know why they chose Dr. Bowen. It's not like he could have done anything. Maybe this is just another hint at Lizzie's guilt. Or maybe there was just so much shock that they didn't know what to do or who to contact in that moment, which is also understandable. Meanwhile, Abby's body had not been found. Dr. Bowen arrived and confirmed Andrew was dead. A neighbor named Adelaide Churchill came over to comfort Lizzie. Adelaide and Bridget walked upstairs, finally discovering the body of Abby Borden in the guest room, where John Morse had slept the night before. While Andrew's body had been warm, Abby's was ice cold, indicating she was killed before him, which meant she was killed when there were only two people in the house, Lizzie and Bridget. Police did address the possibility of an intruder, be it a planned murder or a robbery gone wrong, but there was no sign of a forced entry, no valuables missing, and all doors were locked from the inside. Remember, even Andrew, who owns the home, had trouble getting back inside. And he had all those locks installed after the robbery at the house, which allegedly was at the hands of an outsider. Bridget and Lizzie also never saw any strangers in or around the home, so that theory of an intruder had no solid evidence to go off of. So, what were Bridget and Lizzie up to? Well, shortly after Andrew left for his errands that morning, Lizzie had instructed Bridget to wash the windows, both inside and outside. Remember, this was a sweltering hot day, and Bridget wasn't feeling well. And while I think we've established that Lizzie wasn't the most empathetic person towards Bridget, it's still slightly suspicious that she would have put her up to this task on this day. Many see it as an excuse to get Bridget outside, out of the way and out of earshot for what was about to go down. As for Lizzie, she claimed to be downstairs, ironing handkerchiefs in the dining room. So, did Lizzie hear anything? After all, Lizzie would have been almost directly under the room Abby was killed in. And Abby is said to have weighed about 200 pounds. Surely you would have been able to hear her being hacked to death upstairs, especially considering it's believed she fell forward upon the first hit. Later, during Andrew's murder, Lizzie was allegedly outside, searching the family's barn for lead sinkers for an upcoming fishing trip. That was also suspicious, considering it appeared as though nothing in the barn was looked through. And again, it was so hot that it's unlikely she was out there willingly for an extended period of time. Initially, Lizzie told an officer that she heard a scraping noise and a pained groan before finding her father, but later she said she heard nothing at all. This is just one of many inconsistencies in Lizzie's story, along with changes in where she was during the murders and what she was doing, as she seemingly tried to navigate all of the confusion and the things that just weren't adding up about her alibi. She looked more and more suspicious as more investigating was done. But again, perhaps these contradictions were just from her own shock of what happened and not being able to think straight. You may know the popular rhyme about the murders. Lizzie Borden took an axe, gave her mother 40 whacks. When she saw what she had done, gave her father 41. Aside from the obvious inaccuracy that Abby was not actually Lizzie's mother, there's some other discrepancies between the real facts and this song that has perpetuated certain beliefs about the case. For example, the murder weapon. We'll get more into this next week as we talk about the trial and investigation. But I will say the murder weapon was never definitively identified. While this is probably one of the most famous axe murder cases, it's more likely a hatchet was used. Even then, there are a variety of theories about what was actually used to wreak such havoc on the bodies of Andrew and Abby Borden, which leads us to the injuries sustained, also varying from the rhyme. Here's the facts. Abby had been found face down on the floor between the bed and dresser in the guest room. It's believed the first blow was administered from behind, causing her to collapse forward onto the ground. There were no defensive wounds and no sign of a struggle, like the murderer was able to sneak up behind her. She'd been making the bed, so perhaps she could have been knelt down already. I don't know, it's just hard to believe that she wouldn't have seen this person coming. Or if she did, maybe it was someone that she knew, so she didn't really have a reason to scream or run when she first saw them. She had one wound above her left ear, one between her shoulder blades about 4 inches deep, and 17 to the back of her head and neck. 19 hits, some so forceful they split her scalp and skull open. Her body would then lie there, surrounded by a pool of coagulated blood until being discovered. As for Andrew, he was slumped on the living room sofa. He suffered between 10 and 11 wounds, one above his ear that would have left him unconscious immediately. His nose was completely shattered. He had a deep gash in his cheek, his skull was crushed, and one eye was split in half, having come loose from the socket. If you wish to indulge your morbid curiosities today, The crime scene photos are available for these murders. In fact, they were the first crime scene photos taken in the United States. Sorry if you can hear those sirens in the background, but they kind of fit the vibe. These murders were aggravated and personal. This was not a robbery gone wrong, and if it would have been an outsider, they would have had to plan extensively to slip through unseen and unheard while committing such a violent act. There's something I haven't told you yet that happened on August 3rd, the night before the murders. Lizzie went to her neighbor, Alice Russell, expressing her fear that her father had enemies targeting the family, citing their recent illness as an attempt at poisoning. I feel as if I wanted to sleep with my eyes half open, with one eye open half the time, for fear they will burn the house down over us, Lizzie told Alice, who recalled the conversation later during the investigation. Speaking of her father, Lizzie said, "I'm afraid sometimes that somebody will do something to him. He is so discourteous to people." So, I guess the question to ask is, was Lizzie genuinely concerned? Was there actually someone targeting the Bordens? Someone who would go as far to murder them in such a gruesome manner? Or did Lizzie plant this seed, knowing the crimes she would commit just the next morning? I'm so sorry to do this, but that's where I'm going to leave you for now. Next week, we'll get into the aftermath of the murders and the events of the trial. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time, stay spooky. This has been Mirrors, Horrors, History, and Hauntings. Produced and hosted by Gabby Hope Fry.